U.S. History B Virtual Interactive Notebook 5. This is Nixon to Clinton. So we're going to cover just a huge span of history, and we're not going to talk about very much of it at all, frankly, but there's just no other way to do it. This is an abbreviated history class. Day 1 is Vietnam. Your essential question is, why did the USA lose in Vietnam? The main idea is Vietnam. The subtopics are escalation, Tet, and anti-war movement. Today's notes are based on section 3 of chapter 30 in your online textbook. So, escalation, Tet, and the anti-war movement. Escalation refers to the fact that troop levels drastically escalated during the 1960s. So it was Eisenhower who actually got us into Vietnam. Remember that the Korean War, we didn't win and we didn't lose. Korea remained divided between the communist North and the capitalist South. Vietnam after World War II was in a similar situation. The North was communist and the South was capitalist. Eisenhower wanted the South of Vietnam to remain free, and so he sent American advisors in the late 1950s up to 1961 to train the South Vietnamese army. Now, as far as I can tell, they didn't see much combat. Right? The combat they did see would have been because they happened to be training the units in the field when combat occurred. So under President Kennedy, troop levels rose, I believe, to 19,000 by 1963. Now, before Kennedy was assassinated, he was talking about getting out of the Vietnam War. He wasn't sure that we should be there. He thought that maybe this thing might turn into a prolonged struggle that he didn't need, or that the country didn't need. But then he was assassinated. Lyndon Baines Johnson, there was an incident where North Vietnamese patrol vessels attacked an American destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is essentially the east coast of Vietnam. And that did happen. These patrol boats did fire on the Maddox. Didn't do any damage. Now, later, I think it was the next day, during the night, sonar operators on the Maddox heard torpedoes in the water. Those torpedoes were not there. There's a lot of question as to whether they even heard this, but whatever, Lyndon Baines Johnson asked Congress to give him the authority to essentially go to war in Vietnam. Now, we never actually declared war in Vietnam, which is strange because the Constitution says that to go to war, the president has to ask for a declaration, and Congress declares war. I think Congress can actually do it on its own, too. We never did that. Instead, we had the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized President Johnson to use almost unlimited force against North Vietnam. So essentially, we have a war. Now, strangely, Johnson felt trapped by this. He didn't really want to go to war in Vietnam. At least that's the reading that I've read, but he felt like he had to. So if you look at the graph that I provided, you can see that troop levels in 1965 jumped to just about 200,000. In 1966, they jumped to just about 400,000. In 1967, they jumped to just about 500,000. They peak in 1968. So at the peak, about 550,000 U.S. service personnel served in Vietnam. Johnson escalated the war. All during this time, he told us that we were winning. So for your notes for escalation up here, I want you to copy this graph that I've placed in your assignment sheet. So go ahead and pause the video and copy that graph now. Now, something happened in 1968 called the Tet Offensive. Tet is Vietnamese New Year, and all through the war, this had been a day of truce. There was supposed to be no fighting on Tet. Well, leading up to Tet in 1968, the North snuck huge amounts of military personnel and equipment, including tanks, believe it or not, into South Vietnam. The way the war was run was there were South Vietnamese guerrillas who fought the U.S., and the North would periodically send regular army forces south to reinforce the guerrillas in the South. Those were the Viet Cong. We're covering a lot of territory here. Well, in Tet 1968, they launched attacks on U.S. bases all over the South. So this made it to the news, And LBJ had been telling us that we're winning the war, but if they can put up an offensive like this, it doesn't look like we're winning. So this is when America turned against the war. This is when, if you look at the polls, the majority of Americans before 1968 supported the war, but after 1968, they were against the war. And the critical difference was the Tet Offensive, what happened during Tet. Now, if you look at the actual results of Tet, the United States stomped the Viet Cong in the North, absolutely stomped them. They couldn't do anything like that for the rest of the war. They were crippled after Tet, but it did not matter because it turned the American people against the war. And that's why we will back out of Vietnam, because the people turned against it. Now, the people, in my opinion, had a point. What are we doing over there? Right? We got involved in a bloody civil war that would go on even after we withdrew from the thing and would end up in a northern victory. So, I'm just saying it wasn't it wasn't the best setup for a war that we've ever entered. That's for sure. Okay. So the Tet Offensive turned American opinion against the war. That's what I want you to write from those notes. Now, for anti-war movement, I provided you with 2 videos. One of the videos is, it's about Iowa in particular, so that's pretty specific, but I just thought that it gave you a flavor for what the anti-war movement was like. And it's this movement that produced what people call the hippies, right? The New Left, the hippies, anti-war movement. So I want you to watch that. And then below that, in item 4, I want you to watch a video which shows the experiences of veterans coming home from Vietnam. This happened to my father, too. Veterans who came home from Vietnam were blamed by their peers for the Vietnam War, and they were spit on, and they were called baby burners. Now, the anti-war left since then does not want to own that. That 100% happened. It happened to my dad. He's not lying. All right, so I want you to see this. Now, since Vietnam, we have learned not to blame veterans for the wars that we make them fight. And I feel very strongly about that. But that didn't happen then. The number of Vietnam veterans who've committed suicide, I think now is over 150,000. So 55,000 about veterans died in the Vietnam War. Something like at least 3 times that number committed suicide after the war. And a huge percentage of homeless people who are adult men in their 70s are Vietnam veterans. And a lot of psychologists say it's because of this hatred of veterans that they experienced when they came home. They were not welcomed back like the veterans of World War II, and they were not forgotten like the veterans of Korea. They were despised. My father said that when he was my age, you didn't tell people you were a Vietnam veteran. It was like a dirty thing. And they would kind of veterans would meet each other and they'd say, "Hey, are you a vet?" "Yeah." "You a vet?" "Yeah." It's something you hid, right? Which is very sad. So I want you, under anti-war movement, to write down your impressions of the video in item 3 and the video in item 4. And I understand this is a controversial subject and I don't want to offend anybody, but I do want to tell at least what I perceive the truth to be. And I think this is a pretty even presentation of that. All right, I will see you tomorrow for day 2.